too many of you cry. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you die. You know we've got to find a way to bring some loving.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. My name is Leah Jones, and I am the Education Coordinator here at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Before we get started today, as usual, I'd like to do a brief land acknowledgement. While we are on a video call right now, and many of us are joining in from different places, we really want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of the indigenous peoples. I am joining in from so-called Richmond, Virginia, and I am currently located on the land of the Powhatan and Chickahominy peoples. If you are unsure of whose land you are on and you would like to find out, you can visit at native-land.ca to find out. Okay, great. So hello everyone. It's great to be back on again this week. Um, I am so excited to be here with you all again today. I know it has been quite a whirlwind this whole GA session. Thank you so much to everyone who has been tuning in to the show for GA updates. It has been quite the session, definitely a change of pace from last year. And considering the dynamics from last year and all the changes that were made within the legislature, right? Within the House, we went from 5 Dems. We went from being ahead, gained 5 Dems ahead, to now gaining 2 Republicans. Dems lost 7 seats and 21 Dems to 19 Republicans in the Senate. Virginia's new governor, Glenn Youngkin, also presented additional challenges throughout this session as well, which we have been confessing to you all and sharing a little bit about, speaking a little bit about during our updates this year. So it has been quite the year indeed. Also, before we proceed any further, we have to thank Kadeska Brave for returning again and for giving us all the details and the nitty-gritty of the bills that were presented throughout the session. Your insight has been so helpful. Thanks so much, Kadesh. How are you
Yeah.
doing?
Hi, Leah. I'm doing well. I hope everyone's doing well as well on this Friday afternoon. I'm just glad to be here and also glad that the session is wrapping up in a big way.
Awesome. Yeah, just today we wanted to talk about the bigger picture, right? More so about our final reflections, something that kind of wraps it all up along with the narrative that's associated with it. So we saw all these things happening throughout the session this year. We heard about our environmental boards, our citizen boards, a lot of things being pressured and threatened to be lost as far as rights and a lot of times resources for our vulnerable communities being threatened during the session. So we now want to talk about just what were some of the biggest and greatest losses from this session, and really just reflect back to see if we also maybe had any wins. Kadesh, do you have anything that you feel like was a loss from this session, and even any wins?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned in your preamble, we did lose a lot of good delegates and, a lot of good champions of justice this session. So it was really, it was a hard session, to say the least, with a lot of the bills that we saw being a lot of regressive bills that would send us back in terms of our energy justice, environmental justice, our climate justice progress here in the Commonwealth. And I'm going to kind of start off with the bad news as always and go into the good news. So, thinking of the losses that we've had this session, our biggest loss was losing the authority and the full power of the environmental citizen boards. Um, our you know water boards and air pollution boards are set so that um, our regulatory framework for protecting the environment can include citizen participation in certain permitting decisions, right? Especially when we're thinking of permitting decisions that will pollute a lot of communities. So participation in citizen boards allowed Virginians to have a meaningful voice and really come in and stand to protect the Commonwealth's natural resources and stand up for environmental justice. So there were a lot of legislation that were proposed to undermine the Virginia's Air Pollution Control Board, the State Water Control Board, and the Waste Management Citizen Board by limiting and transferring their permitting powers to the Department of Environmental Quality. And we are recognizing this as a loss because of the fact that it really stifles the meaningful voice that a lot of our communities have in protecting the Commonwealth's communities and natural resources. So, now uh, initially, members of the boards were nominated by the governor and then confirmed by the General Assembly for 4-year terms. However, bills have passed now that the appointment of the members of the citizen boards are being decided by the General Assembly as well as the governor. But the General Assembly will have an option to choose from the Senate and the House, and then the governor will, appoint a couple folks as well. So, the old model had provided us a sense of, inclusion and kind of consistency in decision making, as well as really understand and really create a bipartisan political structure during on these boards. However, it's really hard now if the both chambers are controlled by one of the political parties. Then we won't have a partisan voice in the citizen board, so it would be mostly a one political voice. So it's so the bills that have passed as they stand really, one, limit the power of these citizen boards in permitting, and two, kind of don't really have that kind of political inclusivity, that bipartisan feeling to the boards anymore. So
It
we
sounds like
are
it's
setting.
taking away people's like voices, right? People's opportunity to have a voice on like these really important permits and industry coming in.
Exactly. Part of the negotiation during these bills were, keeping public participation during permitting or not. And, with our coalition members here in Virginia, we fought really hard to keep that public participation aspect. However, it still stands that the permitting power, although the citizen boards hear the stories of impact impacted communities, they still don't have the permitting decisions that could affect polluting industries from coming into the communities, because they don't have that decision to say no or anymore. So that was one of our biggest losses, and it was a sad loss. But going to the good side, the good wins, even though we saw a lot, and I mean a lot of bills that, and you can check out our past videos to really see the bill numbers and all that in detail. We've seen a lot of bills that undermined Reggie or tried to entirely repeal the Community Flood Preparedness Act, which is the bill that kind of kept us in Reggie in 2020. And so we really, garnered and really put up our defenses in protecting the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act, as well as certain provisions in the Regional Green Gas Initiative, Reggie. So we joined Virginia joined Reggie in 2020, and then established the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And so this program is a market-based program, and it has 11 participating states and including Virginia, that generate new funds while reducing electricity sector emissions. So we really saw a lot of bills that try to undermine Reggie by, creating provisions that will allow industry that had contracts before 2020 to really allow to continue polluting without being accountable to Reggie. And we saw some bills that attacked some funding of the Reggie. For instance, we know that the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act directs 50% of the Reggie revenue to low-income energy efficiency programs, and 45 to flood resiliency projects, and 5% to administrative costs. And we've seen bills that try to really move away these funds from the low-income designation to private industry, which already has enough funding in terms of being prepared for flooding. So we defeated money bills like HB 1301, HB 892, and 118 that
HB5.
HB5, right, that really
Mhm.
tried to play with Reggie and our participation in Reggie, or even try to take away our participation in Reggie, which, is really it's kind of crazy to think about because of the fact that Reggie has been bringing a lot of funds to the Commonwealth just in the last year alone. And the Commonwealth has seen a lot of benefits even during COVID and in a pandemic because of the funds generated from Reggie. So, I'm
Right.
not saying Reggie solved all the pandemic problems, but, having money come in through Reggie did help us not be in a hole during the pandemic, in a financial hole during the pandemic. So it was a lot of wins because we defeated a lot of the bad bills that came with Reggie. Um, and with that, we also have seen a lot of flood resilience legislation that have passed and have made a lot of great impacts for that will make a lot of great impacts for a lot of communities. And really, a lot of these bills were championed by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and our coalition at VCN. And we were really thankful to see a lot of bills passed to really strengthen Virginia's flood preparedness plans across counties and localities, as well as really establish some funding in terms of how do we become a flood resilient state. So that was a great win as well. And another win in the midst of this bad session is something that we really championed for the session as part of our transportation justice campaign. And those were the two trip bills, the transit ridership incentive program trip bills. These two bills, HB 142 and SB 342, both passed their respective chambers and are now waiting to be signed by the governor. And they're basically changed the language for the trip funding from the limits of 25% to the basic becoming 25%. So the cap was at 25%. Now the language now says at least 25% of the program has to go to low income and incentivizing programs like zero fare that will really allow low income communities and under deserved communities to take advantage of public transportation. So we really are excited about those bills and expanding this idea of zero fare across the Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's great. I think, well, obviously, citizen boards, that sounds like a really great loss. That was a really great loss. And it's something that we'll definitely be looking forward to next year, right? Hopefully, to push back and find ways to maybe make it more bipartisan again and include that voice, that inclusion that you were talking about. But once again, also, we can't avoid, like you said, we definitely have to bring to the forefront our wins against Reggie, because it was really, even now we see pushback from Governor Youngkin, all about Reggie ongoing still. And we see that, like you said, we've already seen how it benefits the Commonwealth, how it's been benefiting the residents who live here. So if we were to take away Reggie, it would be a severe loss. So it's definitely something that is vital, I think, to keep around, especially when we're talking about flood resilience, and it's only going to like the funds and resources that are needed for these underserved communities that you mentioned, especially when we're talking about resiliency, will only become more important as we continue to see the negative impacts of climate change, right? In the Hampton Roads area, especially. So that, along with our the wins that we've seen in transportation, absolutely, it sounds like a really great progress towards making our transportation systems more equitable, right? Which is what we're all about. One of the things we're really pushing for, and glad that came out of this session. So thanks, Kadas, for wrapping that up for us. It sounds like overall some of the things that were our greatest losses were also some of the things that were most threatened. What we saw with our citizen boards, with Reggie, those things were really being put under pressure. And even though we came out on top with Reggie, with a lot of these bad bills that were on the table, like HB5 and the others that you mentioned, there still was that loss of those citizen boards, which was really one of our greatest protections, right? Especially when we're talking about justice and making sure the voices that need to be heard are heard. So now I'm kind of thinking, what can we do now? Looking past this session, taking what we've learned from this session, what should we be looking forward to next year?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, I know, from your preamble again, a lot of the results of a lot of the chaos, I would call it chaos this session, came from, losing a couple of, about 4 seats in the House. And we really did notice that it was less than 700 votes that made those, that stole those seats in the House. And it's really up to us to really pay attention to the smaller locality elections, and then really making sure that our, and within our districts, we elect folks that are responsible for the environment, responsible for our neighbors, and responsible for, for the poor and low income communities here in Virginia, because we saw, when we elected folks that don't align with that mission, we saw what the results were this session, right? And it was, we get legislators who are, really missing the point in terms of understanding the idea of justice, and incorporating ideas of justice in legislation. And we kind of felt, it's important that we always come back, regardless of all the losses that we've seen. We can always come back next year in terms of the next session to really fight for, again, for what's right and morally just, in terms of pushing for legislation that still pushes for equity and inclusion in a lot of the the environmental sectors. I also wanted to mention, in terms of losses, I didn't highlight a couple of bills that we were leading on this session that we lost, but I didn't want to bring them up again because we have covered them in the past multiple times since they were killed as soon as they got to committees. But those bills were our protecting our neighbors from utility disconnection bills, HB's 1057 and HB 664, which would have really allowed for folks that are in dire situation, like our most vulnerable communities, and low-income families, to really have a grace period of not having their utilities, water, gas, and electric disconnected in times of crisis. We saw that those bills were killed in committee, and it was because of, like I mentioned, those seats that we lost from the House. Same with our other priority bill, our healthy community strategy bill that encouraged localities to really look at healthy communities and environmental justice, really didn't really didn't make it past the uh, committee on cities, towns, and counties because of the fact that that subcommittee was made up with folks that really didn't believe in environmental justice. So we really have to looking forward in terms of next year, really continue pushing for what we believe in, what we have been pushing for to advance environmental justice and climate justice, and really you know try to eradicate social injustices here in the Commonwealth, but also really participate in the localities, in the local elections, local permitting processes, really in local government because it matters. We have seen it in terms of this session, how it can really affect the lives that we live because they directly impact our laws and what governs our daily life, basically.
Right. We have to show up for ourselves and for our communities, right? And elections are definitely a big part of that because we saw how much of a difference it made within this session, right? And now we're here for 4 years. So we have to make the most of the elections that we have to try and inform some as a strategy, right, to fight these perspectives, these bills that come, these legislations that come into play during session that are really speaking against progressiveness and protecting our neighbors and really providing them resources and even trying to strike down the things that have already been put in place to protect them and that people are already benefiting from, like we've just described earlier. So, absolutely, totally agree with that. So, with that being said, what do you feel like are the impacts? What impacts do the results of this session have on advancing environmental justice in the Commonwealth? What do you feel like are some of your biggest takeaways or even just your final reflections?
Yeah, I feel like I kind of have been, taking jabs at this question as I've been explaining, the losses and the impacts at the same time. But I really want to emphasize that, uh, I think in terms of advancing environmental justice here in Virginia, it takes the people. That's what I really realized from this session, right? Because the people didn't show up to elect, the proper person in office. We have now lost all these protection that had existed for a lot of communities to say no to pollution, to say no to cumulative impacts of pollution in their homes, right? So I think one of the biggest takeaways is that you were right to really start this talking about the election and losing the seats in the House because that is the impact that we see now in this session, or we have seen in this session since it has wrapped up. But in terms of advancing environmental justice in the Commonwealth, we did defeat a lot of bills, and we did have a couple of bills that still pushed forward this narrative of advancing environmental justice and making sure we include the most vulnerable at the center of our legislation. But a lot of the bills didn't do that. They failed to really include the most vulnerable at the center of the legislation and work their way out. And so I think it did teach me that we still have a lot way to go in terms of understanding the narrative of environmental justice and what that means, and how environmental justice can bring in, not just protect the health of the community, but it can bring in wealth. And it can bring in really a safe and thriving community, can advance thriving communities in the Commonwealth. And I think we just have a lot more work to do in terms of really spreading that narrative and making sure folks understand, even from the everyday folks that we see and our neighbors, but to even our representatives. They really need to understand that environmental justice will do us good and not harm. Um, so yeah, those were my biggest takeaways and my final reflections.
Definitely. I think everything that you said, I can definitely second. I think that we still see that so much still needs to be understood about environmental justice and really what that looks like, especially within our legislature and providing those really vital protections to protect our neighbors and make sure that justice is in play in regards to our environment and the way that we live, and our quality of life in regards to environment, industry, access to resources, and all of that. But I think also now this brings us to a close. Thank you so much again, Kades, for all of your input. As usual, it's been so insightful, and we've truly enjoyed hearing your thoughts and you walking us through this entire GA session. So thank you so much. We wouldn't have been able to keep up without you. It's been a pleasure. For all of you watching at home, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you all who have taken action with us this GA session. It's truly appreciated. We know that we need these voices. We need our voices to be heard in the legislature. So thank you so much for continuing to uplift that alongside us. We hope to see you soon in our upcoming events, our bigger picture discussion coming soon, along with our screening for Youth v. Government. Please be sure to check out all of our upcoming resources as well resources and events by joining our supporters list, which will be up on the screen here. Please join us and keep up with us, and we hope to see you back on the show again next week. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Leah.